Chapter 3. Salvation. The Christian before the cross. Now I saw in my dream that the road where Christian had to pass had on each side a wall called salvation. Isaiah chapter 26 verse 1. Over there. Then, he ran with great difficulty because of the weight he was carrying on his back. He ran until he came to a higher place where there was a cross, and a little lower down a tomb. As soon as the Christian reached the cross, his burden was released from his shoulders and, falling to the ground, he rolled until he fell into the tomb, and he never saw her again. Psalm 103 verse 12. The Christian, already feeling relieved, exclaimed with joy, "Blessed is he who has given me rest with his sufferings and life with his death." Isaiah chapter 53 verse 6. John chapter 3 verses 16 to 18. Romans chapter 5 verses 8 to 10. Second letter to the Corinthians chapter 5 verse 21. First letter of John chapter 4 verses 9 and 10. There he stood for a few moments, stunned to see how easily his load had fallen. He looked and looked until the tears began to run down his cheeks. Zechariah chapter 12 verse 10. But behold, while he was watching and crying, 3 resplendent beings came and greeted him saying, "Peace be with you." Immediately the first said to him, "Your sins are forgiven you." Mark chapter 2 verse 5. The second took off his rags and dressed him in white clothes. Zechariah chapter 4 verse 4. The third put a seal on his forehead. Revelation chapter 22 verse 4, and handed him a roll of parchment bearing a seal. Ephesians chapter 1 verse 13, with the task of reading it on the way and delivering it to the heavenly city, after which they went on their way. The Christian now took 3 leaps of pure joy, and began to walk singing, "I have been burdened under the weight of my sins. No one could relieve me until I got here. Oh, what a place is this! Here my happiness begins." The captives. Simple laziness and conceit. Later I saw in my dream that he continued until he reached the bottom of a slope. He saw at the side of the road 3 men fast asleep and with shackles on their feet. One was called Simple, the other Laziness, and the third Presumption. Seeing them in this state, Christian approached them to see if he could wake them up, and he shouted at them, "You are like those who sleep on the top of a mast, who have the Dead Sea below, a bottomless abyss." Proverbs chapter 23 verse 34. Wake up, then, and come with me, and I will help you to remove your shackles, for if he who walks like a roaring lion passes through here, you will be prey to his teeth. First letter of Peter chapter 5 verse 8. Waking up, the 3 answered. First he made it simple. "I don't see any danger." Laziness. He added, "We'll sleep a little while longer." Presumption. He said, "What do you care what happens to us?" And with this, they went back to sleep and Christian continued on his way. The formalist and hypocrisy, cheaters. Still worried, Christian saw 2 men jumping over the wall on the left side of the road, and they caught up with him at an accelerated pace. One of them was called Formalist, and the other, Hypocrisy. The Christian asked them, "Where did they come from and where are they going?" They answered, "We were born in the country of vainglory and we go to Mount Zion in search of praise." Why didn't they go in through the gate at the head of the road? Don't you know that it is written that he who does not enter by the door, but climbs up another way, is such a thief and robber? John chapter 10 verse 1. They replied that their compatriots considered the gate too far, and that their usual way of entering was to leap over the wall as they had done. Do you not think that it will be counted as a transgression against the Lord of the place where we are going, thus violating his revealed will? They told him that, as far as that was concerned, he did not have to worry. Besides, they said, the point is that we got in, and what does it matter how? To which, Christian replied, I walk according to my teacher's rules, you according to the impulse of your whims. You are already counted as thieves by the Lord of the road, for which you will not count on his mercy. John chapter 14 verse 6. To this they did not answer anything, they only told him to take care of himself. Then I saw that each one went his way, without much to say. Judges chapter 21 verse 25, except that the two men told Christian that in terms of the law and ordinances they did not doubt that they had to follow them as he. You will not be saved by the laws and ordinances, since you did not enter by the gate. John chapter 1 verses 7 through 9. Galatians chapter 2 verse 16. The others didn't answer. They just looked at each other and laughed. The hill of difficulties. I then saw that they all reached the foot of the hill of difficulties, where there was a spring. Two other paths led from there in addition to the one that came straight from the narrow gate. The first led to the left and the second to the right of the foot of the hill, plus the narrow path went straight up the hill called Difficulties. The Christian first went to the spring and drank water to refresh himself. Immediately he began to climb the hill. The other two also reached the foot of the pass, but when they saw that the slope was high and steep, and that there were two other easier paths, they decided to follow them. The name of one of these was Danger, and that of the other, Destruction. One took the path of danger, and ended up in a large forest, and the other followed the path of destruction, which led him to an immense field full of dark mountains, where he stumbled and fell without being able to get up again. Then I looked at Christian, to see how he was going up the hill, and I noticed that he stumbled and often fell, and many times he climbed on his hands and knees because of the steepness of the slope. Now, halfway up the ascent there was a pleasant grove of trees, made by the Lord of the hill to rest tired pilgrims. There, then, Christian arrived and sat down to rest. Then he took the scroll from his chest and began to read to console himself. He also returned to admire the clothing that had been given to him at the place of the cross, and now calm, he soon began to doze. Then he fell into such a deep sleep that it detained him there until almost nightfall, and being asleep, he dropped the scroll from his hands. While he was sleeping, one ran up to him and woke him up, saying, Look at the ant, O lazy man, look at his ways, and be wise. Proverbs chapter 6 verse 6. And with that, Christian jumped to his feet and started up the hill again at a good pace until he reached the summit. At the top of the hill, two men came running to meet him. The name of one was Fearful, and that of the other, Distrustful, to which Christian asked, Gentlemen, what is happening? They are running in the opposite direction. Fearful, he replied that they were heading to Mount Zion but that they had climbed to this difficult place. But the more we walk, he added panting, the more dangers we find. That's why we turned around and now we're going back. Yeah, he said. Distrustful, because a little further on there are two lions on the road. Whether they are awake or asleep, we don't know, but if we get within their reach, they will surely tear us to pieces. What they say scares me, he said. Christian, but where could he go to be safe? I'll keep going. The loss of Christian who sleeps during the day. Thus, distrustful and fearful, ran down the hill, while Christian continued on his way. But thinking about what those men had said, she searched for the scroll in her bosom, to read it and receive comfort, but no matter how hard she searched, she could not find it. Very afflicted, Christian did not know what to do because he needed what he used to console himself, and what would have been his pass to the heavenly city. He reproached himself for being so foolish as to fall asleep in that place that had been placed there to get some rest from his fatigue. Therefore, he undertook the return until he saw the grove. He scolded himself for having fallen asleep, saying, "Oh, miserable me! To have slept during the day. Fall asleep in the midst of difficulty." First letter to the Thessalonians chapter 5 verses 7 and 8. Apocalypse chapter 2 verses 4 and 5. To have yielded to the flesh. How many steps have I taken in vain? This same thing happened to Israel, because of their sin they had to return by way of the Red Sea. And now I have to go forward with pain, which I could have done with joy, if it had not been for this sinful dream. I have to walk the same path twice, when it would not have been necessary to do it more than once. Oh, I wish I hadn't fallen asleep. By this time, he had reached the grove where he sat down and wept for a while, but at last looking around sadly, he saw the scroll, which he immediately picked up, and trembling, she put it into her bosom. What joy this man had when he had recovered the scroll, because this was the safety of his life. First letter of John chapter 5 verse 13. He also remembered again what they had told him about the lions. And, Christian said to himself, "These beasts walk at night looking for their prey, and if they find me in the dark, how will I escape their clutches?" And so he went on his way, all the while lamenting his unhappy mistake, when suddenly he looked up, and behold, he saw a magnificent palace. The name of the palace was Beautiful, and it was on the side of the royal road. Chapter 4. Fraternal Communion. The Beautiful Palace. Now I saw in my dream that Christian hurried towards the palace to see if perhaps he could stay there, but after a little while he entered a narrow passage that was about 100 meters from the palace. In front of him he saw 2 lions on the road, so he was afraid to go forward, and he thought about turning back. The doorman saw that the Christian was hesitating, as if he were going to return. But the vigilant goalkeeper exclaimed, "Is your faith so little?" Mark chapter 4 verse 40. Do not fear the lions, for they are chained and were put there to test the faith and to find out who does not have it. 1 Peter chapter 1 verse 7. Keep walking down the middle of the road, and you will come to no harm. Then I saw that he was moving forward, following the porter's instructions very carefully. Although he heard them roar, he received no harm. Then he clapped his hands and continued until he reached and stopped at the door where the doorman was. The Christian asked the doorman, "Sir, what house is this? Can I spend the night here?" This house was built by the Lord of the hill, and he did it for the relief and safety of the pilgrims, the watchman replied. He also asked her where she came from and where she was going. "I come from the city of destruction and I am going to Mount Zion, but I would like, if possible, to spend the night here." "But how come you've come so late? The sun has already set. I would have arrived sooner. Unfortunate me." Romans chapter 7 verse 24, "If it hadn't been for the fact that I fell asleep in the grove that is on the way up. While asleep I lost my certificate. Later, Looking for it and not being able to find it, I had to return, in spite of myself, to the place where I slept, and there I found it. And now here I am. All right. I will call one of the palace maids, who, if she approves of what you say, will introduce you to the rest of the family, according to the house rules. The watchman then rang a bell, at whose sound a beautiful maiden who seemed serious appeared at the door, called Discretion, who after talking with him could do what seemed best to her, according to the regulations of the house. She asked him where he came from and where he was going, and he told her. She also asked him what he had seen and found on the way, and he told her everything. Then she smiled, and after a brief pause, she said, "I'll call 3 more of the family." He ran to the door and called for Prudence, Mercy and Charity, who took him to where the family was, and many of them received him on the threshold saying, "Come in, blessed of the Lord, for this house was built precisely to accommodate pilgrims like you." So the Christian followed them inside. As soon as he had entered and sat down, they gave him something to drink and agreed that while dinner was being prepared, some of them would chat for a while with the Christian to take advantage of the time. Prudence asked him, "What do you do to get rid of your anxieties?" "Yes, I only have to remember what I saw on the cross, that frees me from them. And when I look at my embroidered garment, that does too. Furthermore, when I read the scroll that I carry in my bosom, it also does. And when I think with hope where I am going, they disappear." Hebrews chapter 12 verse 1-3. Then he continued to talk charity with him. He began, asking, "Do you have family? You're married. I have a wife and 4 small children. And why didn't you bring them with you?" Responding, the Christian wept. "Oh, how gladly I would have done it. But everyone was against my trip." "What reasons did they give for not accompanying you?" "They were afraid of missing out on the foolish pleasures of the world. So for one reason and then another, they let me go alone. But if you admonish the wicked, and he does not turn from his wickedness and his evil way, he will die for his wickedness, but you will have delivered your soul." Ezekiel chapter 3 verse 19. About the Lord of the Hill. Later I saw in my dream that they stayed talking until dinner was ready. The table was full of rich and substantial delicacies, and the whole conversation revolved around the Lord of the Hill, what he had done and the reason why he had built that house. And from what they said, I understood that the Lord had been a great warrior, and that he had fought and killed the one who had power over death. Hebrews chapter 2 verses 14 and 15, but not without running great danger, and this made me love him more. Because, as they said, he did it by spilling a lot of blood, but what filled everything he did with virtue was having done it out of pure love for his country. John chapter 3 verse 16. And also, some of the family claimed to have seen him and talked to him after his death on the cross. They said that they had heard from his own mouth that he loved the poor pilgrims, with a love without parallel. They also gave him an example of what he affirmed, and this was that he had stripped himself of his glory to do this for the poor. Philippians chapter 2 verses 5-11, and that they had heard him say and confirm that he would not dwell alone in Mount Zion. They also said that he had made many pilgrims princes, although by nature they had been born beggars in a dunghill. First Book of Samuel chapter 2 verse 8. Psalm 113 verse 7. They continued talking until late at night, and after having entrusted themselves to the protection of the Lord, they retired to rest. The pilgrim was taken to a large room on the upper floor, which had a window facing east. The name of the room was Peace, and the Christian slept there until dawn. The next day they took him to the armory, where they showed him all kinds of weapons that the Lord had provided for the pilgrims, such as swords, shields, helmets, breastplates, and shoes that never wear out. They also showed him instruments with which some of his servants had done wonderful things. They showed him the rod of Moses, Exodus chapter 7 verse 20, and chapter 10 verse 13. Numbers chapter 20 verse 11, the pictures with which Gideon put the armies of Midian to flight, Judges chapter 7 verses 19 and 20. Then they showed him the jaw with which Samson did his feats, Judges chapter 15 verse 16. Also the sling and the stone with which David killed Goliath of Gath, and also the sword with which the Lord will slay the man of sin on the day he rises to face the prey. Second letter to the Thessalonians chapter 2 verse 3. Apocalypse chapter 19 verse 15, chapter 20 verse 3. His friends said, "If the weather is good tomorrow, we will show you the mountains of delight, which they said would increase your well-being, near your destination." Isaiah chapter 33 verses 16 and 17. It was the land of Emmanuel, and it is as accessible, they told him, as this hill was for all pilgrims. The Christian wanted to follow his path. He went out with his friends to the door, and there he asked the doorman if he had seen another pilgrim pass by, to which the doorman answered yes. "Tell me, did you know him?" asked the Christian. "I asked him his name and he told me his name was Faithful Man." "Ah, I know him. He is from my town. He is my neighbor. He comes from the place where I was born." Do you think there will be much progress? You must have reached the valley of humiliation by now. Well, good porter, the Lord be with you, and add abundantly to all your blessings for the kindness you have shown me. Saying this, he began to move forward, but then the Christian said, "Just as it was difficult to go up, as far as I can see, it is dangerous to go down, because it is difficult to go down to the valley of humiliation, without having a fall on the way." Then I saw in my dream that these good companions gave him a loaf of bread, a bottle of wine, and a bunch of grapes. Chapter 5. Spiritual Warfare. The Christian fights with Apollyon. He began to descend very carefully, nevertheless he gave a slip or two. But already in the valley of humiliation, the poor Christian had a problem. He had gone a little way, when he beheld an evil enemy coming to meet him, whose name was Apollyon. The Christian began to be afraid and to think what would be better, to go back or to remain firm. It was agreed that he had no armor on his back, and therefore, running from the enemy would give him a greater advantage, since he could easily wound him with his darts. Therefore, he decided to take a chance and stand his ground. The Christian continued on his way, and shortly after he ran into Apollyon. The monster was hideous in appearance. He was dressed in scales like a fish, of which he was proud. He had wings like a dragon, feet of gold, and his mouth was like the mouth of a lion. Approaching the Christian, he looked at him with disdain and asked, "Where do you come from and where are you going?" "I am going to Zion and I am coming from the city of destruction, which is a bad place. All that territory is mine, and I am prince and god of it. Therefore, you are one of my subjects, and you have fled from your king. I was born in your domain, but being at your service is hard, and your pay is such that it is impossible to live with it, because the wages of sin is death." Romans chapter 3 verse 23. There is no prince willing to lose subjects, nor am I willing to lose you. But I have already given myself to the King of Kings. How could it be yours again? Asked the Christian. You have already been unfaithful in your service to him. How then do you expect to receive rewards from him? In what have I been unfaithful, Apollyon? You fainted at the beginning of your journey when you almost suffocated in the swamp of mistrust. You tried to get rid of your burden in many ways, when it was fitting that you wait until your prince took it off you. You were guilty of falling asleep and losing the most valuable thing. You also nearly turned back for fear of the lions. And when you talk about your trip, about what you have seen and heard, because of what you say, you show the vainglory of your heart. All this is true, and there would be much more to say, but the prince whom I serve and honor is merciful and quick to forgive. At that moment, Apollyon, unable to contain his rage, burst into voices, saying, I am an enemy of that prince, I hate his person, his laws and his people. I have come with the purpose of getting rid of you. Apollyon, be careful what you do because I am on the king's path, which is the path of holiness, therefore take care. Apollyon, occupying the whole width of the road, said, Do not think that I am afraid of you. Prepare to die, for I swear by my infernal cave that you will not go from here, here I will shed your blood. Saying this, he threw a fiery dart at his chest, but the Christian had a shield on his arm, with which he avoided that danger. Then the Christian drew his sword, for he saw that it was time to defend himself. Apollyon, for his part, attacked him furiously, throwing darts as thick as hail, so that despite everything the Christian did to avoid them, Apollyon wounded him on the head, hand, and foot. This caused the Christian to back off a bit, which Apollyon took advantage of to attack with more fury, but the Christian composed himself and resisted with all the vigor that he could. This terrible combat lasted more than half a day, so much so that the Christian was almost exhausted, because of his wounds, he felt weaker and weaker. Then Apollyon, seeing his opportunity, began to get closer to the Christian, and fighting hand to hand with him managed to throw him to the ground with such violence that his sword slipped from his hand. Seeing this, Apollyon exclaimed, Now I have you cornered. And with that he crushed him so much that he almost suffocated him to death, so much so that the Christian began to despair of his life. But God wanted that when Apollyon was about to unload his coup de grace, the Christian reached out his hand and took his sword, Ephesians chapter 6 verse 17, saying, Do not hang on me, enemy, because even though I fell, I will stand up, Micah chapter 7 verse 8. And with that she gave him a deadly thrust that sent him back like a mortally wounded man. The Christian, noticing this, attacked again, saying, Before, in all these things we do more than conquer through him who loved us, Romans chapter 8 verse 37. And with this, Apollyon spread his dragon wings, fled, and the Christian saw him no more. Unless he has seen and heard it as I saw and heard it, no one can imagine this combat with the awfulness and horror of Apollyon's cries on the one hand, and the wails and groans of the Christian's heart on the other. Not once did I see a pleasant look on him, but when he had wounded Apollyon with his two-edged sword, then he did smile and look up. Hebrews chapter 4 verses 12 and 13. It was the most terrible combat I have ever seen. When the battle was over, the Christian said, Here I will give thanks to him who has delivered me from the lion's mouth, to him who helped me against Apollyon. After he had said this, a hand with leaves from the tree of life was presented to him, Revelation chapter 22 verse 2, which he took and applied to the wounds received in battle. And instantly he was healed. He immediately sat down right there to eat bread and drink from the bottle that had been given to him shortly before. Feeling refreshed, he went on his way with drawn sword, for he thought, there may be another enemy nearby. But in all that valley he did not meet any enemy again. The valley of the shadow of death. At the end of that valley of humiliation there was another, called the valley of the shadow of death, and it was necessary for the Christian to cross it, because in the middle of it was the road to the heavenly city. That valley was very lonely. The prophet Jeremiah describes it like this: a desert and depopulated land, dry land and the shadow of death, a land through which no man passed, nor did man dwell there. Jeremiah chapter 2 verse 6. Here the Christian suffered more hardship than when fighting Apollyon. I then saw in my dream that when the Christian reached the edge of the valley of the shadow of death, he met two men hurrying back in the opposite direction. They were children of those who gave a negative report of the good land. Numbers chapter 13 verse 32. Back, they said. Because, what is it? Asked the Christian. We were going in the same direction as you. We advanced as far as we dared. We looked ahead and saw the valley that is black as pitch. We saw goblins, satyrs and dragons of the abyss. We also heard a continuous howling and shouting, as of people suffering unspeakably, who were prisoners of affliction and were in chains. And over that valley hang the terrible clouds of confusion. Death also constantly spreads its wings over him. In a word, everything is horrible and chaotic. Job chapter 3 verse 5, and chapter 10 verse 22. Hearing this, the Christian replied, "This is my way to my safe harbor. It will be yours, but not ours." With this they left. The Christian continued on his way, although always with the drawn sword in his hand, afraid of being assaulted. The path was very narrow. To the right was a very deep ditch and to the left, a dangerous quagmire. The ditch to the right is the one where the blind have led the blind, both of whom have unfortunately perished. The quagmire to the left, even if a good man falls into it, does not hit bottom. King David once fell into that quagmire and would doubtless have drowned there, if the Almighty had not pulled him out. Psalm 69 verse 14. The good Christian found himself in more trouble, because when he tried in the dark to avoid the ditch on one side, he ran the risk of falling into the quagmire on the other. In addition to the aforementioned dangers, the path here was so dark that when he lifted a foot, he didn't know where he would step. Almost in the middle of this valley, I noticed that the mouth of hell was very close to the road. Now what shall I do? Thought the Christian. I saw how many flames and much smoke came out, with sparks and horrible noises, things that did not heed the Christian's sword, just as Apollyon had not. That is why the Christian was forced to sheathe his sword, and take up the weapon of prayer. Ephesians chapter 6 verse 18. Deliver now, O Lord, my soul. Psalm 116 verse 4, he exclaimed. In this way he continued for a long time. The flames from time to time reached where he was. He also heard lugubrious voices and whirlwinds that came and went, in such a way that at times he believed that he was going to be torn to pieces or trampled like the mud of the streets. This terrible spectacle and these horrible noises followed him for many leagues. And when he reached a certain place, it seemed to him that a band of evil spirits was approaching him. He stopped to think about what he should do. From time to time he leaned back. Then he thought that maybe he had already crossed the middle of the valley. He also remembered how he had overcome many dangers and that turning back could be more dangerous than going forward, so he decided to continue. But the demons seemed to get closer and closer. However, when they were almost where the Christian was, he shouted with all his might, "I will walk in the strength of the Lord God." At this, They fell back and did not bother him again. I do not want to miss a detail. I noticed that now the poor Christian was so confused that he didn't even recognize his own voice. And it was in this that I noticed it. Just as she stood at the edge of the burning pit, one of her fiends pulled her back, gently approached her, muttering terrible profanities that he believed came from her own mind. This affected the Christian more than anything he had encountered so far, to the point that he thought he must now blaspheme the one he loved so much before. But if he could have, he wouldn't have done it, because he didn't have the lucidity to cover his ears or know where the blasphemies came from. As he continued walking disconsolately for a while, he seemed to hear a voice saying, "Even though I walk in the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you will be with me." Joshua chapter 1 verses 7 to 9. Psalm 23 verse 4. Upon hearing this, the Christian was glad for these reasons. First, because from this he inferred that others who feared God were also walking through that valley. Second, because they knew that God was with them even in that dark and sad state. And, why not me too? He thought. Although because of the atmosphere that exists in this place, I cannot perceive it. Job chapter 9 verse 11. Third, I hope to catch up with them to have their company. So he went on his way and called out to the one in front, but he didn't know what to answer, thinking he was alone too. Shortly after dawn dawned, and the Christian said, "Return to the shadow of death tomorrow." Amos chapter 5 verse 8. The sun was already rising. This was another mercy for the Christian, because it must be noted that if the first part of the valley of the shadow of death was dangerous, the second, which he still had to cross until he reached the end of the valley, was even more dangerous because it was so full of traps of all kinds, nets, pits, some deep and projecting, that if it had been dark now, as when he walked through the first part of the valley, he would have perished. But, as I just said, it was dawn. He said therefore, God makes his light shine on me, and with his light I will pass through the darkness. Job chapter 29 verse 3. With this light, then, he reached the end of the valley. Now I saw in my dream that there was blood, bones, ashes and mutilated bodies of men, even bodies of pilgrims who had passed through there in other times. Then the Christian sang, "O wonderful world! I can't say less because I was kept from that danger. I could have been caught, or I would have gotten entangled and fallen. But because I live, to Christ be the glory." The Christian meets the faithful. As the Christian followed his path, he later saw the faithful. Seeing him, the Christian ran with all his might and not only caught up with him, but passed the faithful, so that the last one went first. The Christian smiled, boasting of having passed his brother. But he was so distracted that he stumbled, fell and was unable to get up until the faithful came to help him. They stayed together in a friendly way, talking about everything that had happened to them on their pilgrimage. The Christian began like this: "My dear and beloved faithful brother, I am glad that I have reached you, and that God has tempered our spirits in such a way that we can walk as companions on this pleasant path. How long were you in the city of destruction before you set out on your own pilgrimage?" "Until I couldn't take it anymore, because after you left there was a lot of talk that our city would soon be destroyed by the sky of fire." That's what our neighbors said. Yes, and for some time that was the only topic of conversation. How can it be possible? And only you out of all of them came out to escape danger. Although there was, as I said, a lot of talk about it, I don't think they really believed it. Because in the heat of the discussions I heard that some neighbors made fun of you and your desperate journey, Well, that was what they called your pilgrimage, said the faithful. And your flexible neighbor, who came back covered in swamp mud, was treated with great contempt, and despised as a renegade. Tell me, please, did you meet someone in the valley of humiliation? Yes, I did meet a so-called malcontent, who tried to persuade me to go back with him, his argument being that passing that valley was a disgrace. He also told me that going there was the sure way to displease all my friends, like pride, arrogance, self-esteem and worldly glory, and others that he was sure would be offended if I dared to go through that valley. And how did you answer him? I told him that he was very wrong, that although those mentioned could be called my relatives, and rightly so since they are my relatives according to the flesh, since then I became a pilgrim for what they have disowned me. I also reject them, so it is as if we have never been related. Mark chapter 10 verses 29 to 31. I also escaped from the swamp of mistrust, the faithful continued, only to meet one whose name is debauchery. What a flattering tongue he had! She insisted that I go with her. And at the foot of the hill I found an old man named Adam the First, who lived in the town of Deceit. His work, he said, were many delights and rewards, that I should finally be his heir. Romans chapter 5 verses 6 to 21. Marry my daughters. Lust of the flesh, lust of the eyes and the pride of life, he told me. First letter John chapter 2 verse 16. But looking at his forehead I saw that it was written, Do not lie to one another, having stripped off the old man with his deeds, and clothed himself with the new, which according to the image of the one who created him is renewed until full knowledge. Colossians chapter 3 verses 9 and 10. As I turned to leave, I felt a deadly pinch on the back. The exhortation and prophecy of the evangelist. As soon as they had left that desert, the faithful looked back and saw someone coming. Oh, he said to his brother, who's coming? The Christian looked and said, The evangelist is my good friend. Upon arrival, the evangelist said, Peace be with you, dearly loved, and with all your helpers. Welcome, welcome, my good evangelist, said the Christian. The Christian and the faithful told him everything that had happened to them, and they also wanted him to talk more to encourage them the rest of the way. Then the evangelist began in this way. My children, you have heard the words of the truth of the gospel, that we ourselves glory in you in the churches of God, for your patience and faith in all your persecutions and tribulations that you endure. This is a demonstration of the just judgment of God, so that you may be counted worthy of the kingdom of God, for which you also suffer. Second letter to the Thessalonians chapter 1 verses 4 and 5. Therefore they cannot hope to go far on their pilgrimage without them, be they of one kind or another. James chapter 1 verses 2 to 8. They have already found something of the truth of these statements, and others immediately follow. I have great joy because you have been victors. But they are not yet out of the devil's sight. They will reach a town that is very close, where the enemies will do everything possible to take their lives. One of you will die there. Remember to behave like men and commend your soul to God. First letter to the Corinthians chapter 16 verse 13. Be faithful until death, and the King will give you the crown of life. James chapter 1 verse 12. Apocalypse chapter 2 verse 10. Dear listening friend, on behalf of the Christian Polyglot team, we greet you and we are pleased that you enjoy this channel created and designed for you, where you can listen to the adaptations of the best Christian titles in your language. Books written by renowned authors in the Christian field and inspired by the Word of God. We encourage you to join us and enjoy this new audiobook series entitled, The Pilgrim's Progress, written by Pastor John Bunyan, author of this and other famous titles. John Bunyan, born in Elstow, Bedfordshire, England, in the year 1628, and died in London, in the year 1688, he was a British Baptist preacher. Although John Bunyan conceived of his work primarily as a vehicle to express the religious ideas of Puritanism, the truth is that the clarity of his prose and the references to everyday life made him a model for later British literature. This famous story of one man's journey through life in search of salvation remains one of the most entertaining and brilliant allegories of faith ever written. This most important work of English literature is today considered the best explanatory allegory of theology and Puritan thought. The book is deeply steeped in Scripture, as Bunyan was a committed and persistent Bible student. Next week you invite you to follow us with the penultimate chapters of this series entitled, The Pilgrim's Progress. And if you liked this video and the channel, we encourage you to support us to grow by giving, like, and subscribing so that we can continue working to bring you the best content. Until next week, God bless you.